Well, we're continuing this building project of God's house this week. Last week we took a week off. We had lasagna together. We enjoyed each other's company, eating in community, fellowshipping, singing, and worshiping together. And I've got to be honest, if that's not a picture of what being the church is, then you've got to tell me what else it could be. And that alone shakes out to probably be more biblical than any westernized church we observe today. Because as we've learned over the last couple weeks in this discussion about building God's house, is that Jesus calls us to be the church, not just go to church. When God came on the scene as Jesus, what he had in mind for us to be is this: not create a place for it. Now, my wife, she grew up knowing church all too well as a generational pastor's kid. Her grandfather was a pastor, her father was a pastor, her two brothers are pastors, and then there's me. I also grew up in church, with mom as the church secretary and all those things. And Michelle and I could probably tell you what it's like to be in church and hear people when they enter the church building, like their speech and their actions would become different. Have you ever noticed that? Like, we kids would be outside running around acting a fool. And the second we crossed the threshold of the building, we knew that, things had to change. Hello, dear brother. How art thou today? And yes, be blessed, my brother. And we did this because that's the attitude people kind of gave us. And if you were ever in that type of setting, you knew it. And you knew you were supposed to act this way because this is the house of God. Spelled G-A-W-D if you're going to pronounce it correctly. I mean, we laugh because we heard it. We know this, the house of God ideology. But that's not what Jesus intended his church to be. When Jesus said, I'm going to build my church, he didn't picture calling up a realtor and saying, hey, I need 30 acres of highway front property with some great traffic. And I don't know, do we want to call J.E. Dunn out and get their big cranes? Because, we really want to build this thing big and get some elevators and some escalators because we're going to construct this house of God. I mean, can you picture Jesus doing that? And no, not at all. That wasn't Jesus because, as we learned, church is not an event or a place. Church is not, as we've discussed these past few weeks, some place I go or something I do. So then what is church? Well, church is everybody on an everyday mission, and that includes every area of our life. Church is everyone who calls Jesus Lord and Savior, who has put their love and trust in him. So in turn, he has given us his Spirit that lives inside of us, and that's what empowers us to be Jesus wherever we go and whatever we do, in every area of our life. So now the last time we met, we left off with this story about Jesus in a temple. Remember, a temple being the center of religious activity. And in that story, we encounter Jesus in this really unique moment where he's very angry. And what's really awesome about the story is that when we saw Jesus get angry, what we saw is what Jesus valued. And what Jesus values is people finding their way back to God. And that's what the temple was for. And so we ended that story talking about, Jesus empties the temple out because of all these distractions people were creating that were keeping people from finding God. And Jesus says, this is the place where people can find me in the most accessible way and through prayer. And it's soon after this that the religious leaders, they come to Jesus upset, as most of us would probably do if somebody come along and messed up, the thing we made, tossed our programs out. And so they come up to you and they say, hey, Jesus, by whose authority do you do this? What gives you the right to come here and tear our stuff up? And Jesus answers them and he says, hey, you know what? Destroy the temple and I'll raise it again in 3 days. And now Jesus is actually, as we read on, he's giving them a little foreshadowing as to what is coming. But in that moment, the Pharisees were like, well, this temple? You talking about this temple? And they're like, okay, Jesus, yeah, you're just as crazy as we thought. And so the Pharisees replied, it's taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to rebuild it in 3 days? But the temple he had spoken of was his body. And he, Jesus, was raised from the dead, and the disciples recalled what he said. The disciples at this point were like, oh, now we get it. And so we read on in John 2, it says, then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. And the idea of God with us, that this God, this I am, Jesus is telling us that he is. He's saying, I am God. I'm here with you now. So it's no longer about a building. It's no longer about a temple. And Jesus says, I'm going to destroy the temple as you know it, and I'm going to reestablish it, but it won't come in the form of brick and mortar and a building. It will be established in and through my broken body. No longer will people have to search for a place to find access to God. No, not at all. Now they're going to find it in a person, because the temple is no longer a place, but it is a person. It is a person. It is Jesus. He is now the temple. He is the one, when people are far from God, they can come to find a connection to God. And it's no longer about this idea of coming off a weekend of bad decisions going, well, I guess I better go to church today, because then I just better go to church. It's no longer about going to the place. It's about finding this person, Jesus, who reconnects us back to God. And now you've heard of Paul. He wrote a lot of the New Testament. And Paul, who was Saul in the Damascus Road, and eventually follows Jesus. But at a time, he didn't want Jesus to be known. He did not want people to hear about this Jesus or to hear from Jesus. And he would silence them. And he would follow them to stop their voice and what they were saying. But later on, Paul does become a part of this church, this new church that Jesus has established. And he's sent out to tell other people about Jesus, these people he used to persecute. And Paul, he would write these letters to people in several different areas, on several different occasions. And he goes and he takes this analogy of Jesus being the temple even further when he writes to the church of Corinth in chapter 12. And he writes, now you are the body of Christ, and each one of you is a part of it. No longer is this a temple that we go to, because Jesus has established himself as the temple. And now that Jesus is no longer here on earth, guess what? We now are the representation of Jesus here on earth. Because the house of God, remember, it's not a building, but it's a people. Remember our people bricks? We're the people bricks. It is we the people who've put our trust in Jesus and put our hands in his hands, put our lives in his hands, and allowed his Spirit to dwell in us. And so now we've become the representation of Jesus to the people around us. And this is what being the church is about. Paul goes on to write in this letter, don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple, and that God's Spirit dwells in your midst? So you, insert your name here, are now God's walking temple. I feel like it's a hello, my name is, and write your name in, right? So you, insert your name here, are now God's walking temple, and his Spirit dwells in you. People can come to you to find the presence of God in that regard. I sometimes think now when we prayed, Jesus, come dwell in this place, and I'm not saying anything against that type of prayer, but maybe it should start with Jesus, come dwell in this place. Remember, and as we speak to God and we communicate, it comes in us, through us, and out of us. I believe this whole idea has everything to do with our identity and our love for others, as Jesus taught us to love God and our neighbor. And this has nothing, the idea of being the temple has nothing to do with tattoos, pierced ears, all those things that everyone tried to convince me of years ago. But I mean, seriously, who would ever get a tattoo? That's so yucky. All right, so back on track. You are the temple. We have the same purpose as people bricks in the temple of God. We are the temple. And now that we are the temple, we've identified that his Spirit is alive in us, making us a part of this temple, part of his body, where Jesus says he is the temple. And here's a fantastic meaning of this for us. We now have the opportunity for people who are far from God to connect with God, because that's the purpose of the temple. People will experience Jesus when they encounter the church of Jesus. And the church is where people experience Jesus just being around us. And this is where people who are far from God get to know God by getting to know you. It's no longer about a building, and Jesus has re-identified that by stating He is the temple. And now we are extensions of Jesus to the world around us. And so lately we've used, the past couple weeks, we've used some pictures. We've drawn some really neat stick figures to illustrate this. And so I left you some space in your notes so that we can doodle just a little more. Remember, the first week we identified the church isn't a place to gather, but a place to scatter. So we drew a picture with arrows going out. And then last week, how prayer in the temple is where we can connect to God, where we individually have our own personal connection to God. So today's stick people drawing is this image to show us that it's really not about a vertical connection. It's because we have the opportunity to connect with people who are far from God so that they can experience the love of God through us. So now today we're going to go to our true source, the Bible, and we're going to look at John chapter 8. And as we look at this story, we're going to ask ourselves, how do we prepare ourselves to be Jesus to the people around us? And now this is another story about a temple, a little bit different, but another story about a temple where Jesus redefines what a temple is all about. And remember, the temple is about people finding their way back to God. So Jesus gives us this different mandate on how we are to prepare ourselves to help people find their way back to God. So here we go, John 8. Jesus has been going back and forth from the mountains to the temple courts where he would teach. And early one morning at dawn, Jesus appeared in the temple courts where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. Now we should understand that the temple courts was the place where non-Jews could come. It's the place where the non-Jews were allowed. It was the only place you were permitted as a non-Jewish person, and you would be accepted in the temple. That was it. You couldn't go any further. You weren't permitted. In fact, some archaeologists found a brick from a temple and had an inscription on it, and it basically said, this is the dividing wall between Jews and non-Jews. We get to be near God. You get to be there. We'll tell you about it. It'll be a great story. You'll love it. So it was clear that there was a space for those who were accepted and those who were not. And this is the place that Jesus is sitting, out amongst the non-Jews. So Jesus appears in the temple courts where all the people gather around him. And Jesus did what Jesus does. He sat down with them. And as Jesus is teaching, some teachers of the law and some Pharisees, they walk up, like they didn't know Jesus would be there today. Like, oh, hey, you're here, Jesus. Surprised. And they're seeing this nefarious plan that they have this time unfolding. And the teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. And not only for this woman, we have to understand, it wasn't that it was rumored or it was thought. They caught her in the middle of it. And they made her stand before the group. So they made this woman stand there. She didn't get to cower. She didn't get to hide. They likely propped her up and made her stand there for this judgment that they were going to bring on her. And embarrassed as she was, probably because she was caught in the middle of it, still not fully dressed, naked, ashamed, and fearful of what's going to happen next, they stand her there. And really, it's not about her at all. This is all about them trying to get at Jesus. And they said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery." Hey, Jesus, we caught her. Not only, it's clear that she's guilty. There's no question about it. And they go on, in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. Now, what do you say? And they were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. Now, Jesus, he has a couple of options here. They've posed this question. They've propped this woman up. And Jesus could have said, yep, you know what? You're right. Moses did say that. Let's all get some stones and let's kill her. In fact, some people, maybe they're likely skeptical of God, of who God is, because they can't quite reconcile this Old Testament law. How does this good God allow such horrible things to happen to people? And why would he write laws like this? And what we're going to end up seeing here is not only does Jesus fulfill this and give us a new interpretation, a new understanding of this here pretty quick in a moment, Jesus redefines it all. So anyways, Jesus could have said, yeah, let's just stone her. Let's be done with her, kill her. Now, perhaps what a lot of us would have liked to have seen was Jesus say, hey, you know what? I was thinking about this. It takes two to tango. So not just the woman, but, the law also says the man caught in adultery needs to be brought here too. So you caught her in the act. Where's he at? A lot of us probably would have liked that, right? Why are we just killing this woman off? Where's the dude? But Jesus does neither. In fact, he takes a posture that is so uniquely beautiful in this moment because it says Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. Jesus doesn't separate himself from the woman or from what she's done. He bends down and he changes his posture in this moment. And because of that, Jesus gives us this example where we need to be like him. And we need to be prepared in these moments to engage and not divide. Jesus does not divide himself from the woman. He doesn't say, well, sorry, lady, that's what you get, sorry. No. Instead, Jesus engages this situation. For too long, the church, we could probably think back in our own stories, has not engaged people who were far from God. We've distanced ourselves. We've built our walls, put up our fancy, our fancy steeples and locked ourselves inside. Built these fancy white sepulchers to hide ourselves in. For way too long, we've been against people rather than for them. But Jesus says, my posture is totally different. I'm going to engage people far from God. I'm engaging people who don't feel they have the right or recognition to be around me. And Jesus engages this situation. And when they kept on questioning, he straightened up and said to them, let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. Now, we have no recorded idea of what Jesus was writing in the ground. Perhaps he's making reference to this law that they're quoting. They've been trying to make this encounter all about dividing Jesus from Moses. Maybe he's drawing the correlation, putting them together. I don't know. Jesus could have said, no, I'm better than Moses. Jesus, I am the finger of God who wrote the Ten Commandments. And now I'm the finger of God before you, writing in the dirt. And with me, I bring this whole understanding about the temple and about the grace and everything that God has brought here through me for you. But instead, Jesus says, without. He who is without sin cast the first stone. And all of a sudden, there's this big spotlight turned on the law and on the Pharisees. And they realize all of a sudden they're no different than her. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Perhaps you think you've built up a good resume of good things, to earn God's grace, like the Pharisees, who ended up quickly being reminded just how far and how easily they've fallen short from this acceptable standard. Now, for this woman, the good news is that now she's at the same playing level at the Pharisees. Both of them needing grace, needing acceptance. And we need to be prepared to accept and not to accuse. We will prepare ourselves to help people far from God when we position ourselves to accept them and not accuse them. And be Jesus to those around us by accepting them where they are, who they are, which is they're made in the image of God. Now let's be clear, we've got to watch this one. This is a fine line for some people. Acceptance is not the same as approval. We've got to be clear. We're not talking about approving of people and things. We're talking about accepting the person, which is probably one of the most powerful things we can do. What was it like when someone accepted you? Can you remember that? What was it when you felt accepted by God? Being freed from the burden of having to perform or having to hide your shameful past. And we realize that we're becoming more like Jesus to the people around us by accepting people who are not like us. Instead of accusing them, we accept them and we posture ourselves like Jesus. And it doesn't matter how good your religious resume is, you're accepted. And however shameful your baggage of your life is, you're accepted. Before Jesus, we are all accepted. And that's how we prepare to be the message of hope to the people around us. We embody the good news of Jesus by simply accepting someone that no one else will. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" I always have this idea when I read this story that Jesus stood up and was like having this Columbo moment, you know. You remember Columbo, the detective with the long coat? And I know I just really dated myself. But I was a little kid and it was a sick day and they were old reruns, I promise. But he was this detective and he always would say these really poignant things just right at the end of whatever was going on. And he would kind of appear to be obtuse most of the time, except he would say something that was really profound. And I've always felt like Jesus, was pretending to not know what was going on. He stands up and he's like, "Oh, hey, where is everybody? Nobody? I can imagine her response. She's probably tear-filled, blubbering. She's probably fallen to the ground because no one's there to prop her up. Can you imagine the stress of thinking someone's about to kill you? And all of a sudden, they've all disappeared, and the one who said the thing that made them disappear is the only one there. Can you imagine trying to form words? That stress being relieved from you? And she could probably barely utter the words. And Jesus standing there, the one who's redefined everything, who's made everything more clear than it was before, she says, "No one." Perhaps, like this woman, we feel awkward. We feel awkward. Maybe you're a person that feels awkward in these religious type settings, a little ashamed. Maybe you don't feel like you actually fit. So here's Jesus' response to her and to you today. "Then neither do I condemn you." And like it says, Jesus declared. And I don't know if you know, a declaration is kind of a big deal. When someone's declared something, it's usually something that's said or done in a way that everyone hears it. So everyone in earshot heard Jesus say, "No one condemned you, neither do I." Jesus has redefined the temple. He has expounded and fulfilled the law. And now we can take this example to be Jesus helping others find their way back to God by accepting them. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm glad that God accepts me. In all of this life, I fail, I get it wrong, but I'm still accepted. I'm still made whole, and I'm still redeemed and refined, being refined into the likeness of Jesus. Romans 15:7 tells us that because Christ accepts us, we must accept one another. And with all this going on with this woman and with Jesus and the temple, the Pharisees, they're probably embarrassed. There's all these emotions going on with this woman, everyone walking away, and the only person in the temple court who was without sin was the only one still standing there, and he was the only one without a stone. We need to prepare to be the people who are standing there without a stone, being ready to accept people, being ready to engage them. The people in your life who are far from God, they need to experience the best news. And it may just come from a relationship with you. The news is that they're accepted by you. And why? Because Jesus accepts you, even though you're nothing like him. And perhaps today you say, "I'm far from God. My life's not going the direction Jesus wants for me. I feel unaccepted, unloved, and unwanted." Well, let me tell you that Jesus accepts you right where you are. And this church, these people, will accept you right where you are. So let's be prepared to invest in people who are far from God and invite them to follow Jesus. Because, church, we exist for the people who are far from God. wherever you live, work, and play, be prepared to have a relationship with people so that you can be Jesus to them. And here's 3 real simple ways you can be Jesus to people. Super simple. Invest in people by accepting them where they are. How easy is that? Just meeting people where they are. Jesus met the woman at the well, and just said, "Hey, I see you're getting water. I'd sure like some water." And goes into this whole conversation. The Pharisees bring this woman to be stoned to death, and he goes down to a knee and starts writing in the dirt and meets her where she is. Accepting people where they are. Number 2, we can invest in people by serving them without any expectations. We're more like Jesus when we serve people, when we meet their needs. I don't even know how to expound on that any more than that. It just seems like such a simple idea. Just serve people. And we invest in people by inviting them to be a part of our life. Jesus lastly said to the woman, "Go now and leave your life of sin." Jesus invited her to follow him. And we're inviting people to be a part of our life and follow Jesus with us. Paul wrote, "If you're having trouble seeing Jesus, then follow me as I follow him. Stick with me, live life with me till you can see him on your own." Maybe it's lunch, maybe it's coffee. Whatever it is, how do we use our circle of influence to accept people and be Jesus to them? And I want to encourage you to create these places, to be intentional about environments of acceptance where people can experience Jesus in a new way. And so here's our final thought. We might be the first opportunity for someone to experience Jesus. That's an amazing opportunity because God did not call us to come to church, but to be the church. So you may be the first experience someone has of Jesus because they encounter you, the church. Will you pray with me? Well, God, as always, we humble ourselves before you, grateful that you love us, that you accept us, and that you've provided a way through Jesus for us to come back to you. And God, as you have accepted us and loved us, and Jesus has shown us the way back to you and shown us this acceptance, we now accept one another. Teach us how to live this out in the daily life. Jesus, show us how to walk out this life of posturing ourselves to be accepting, to love people where they are, and to help be the Jesus that they're going to experience, to be the people bricks and the people church that you designed us to be. As we're on this mission, joining with you in our everyday life, helping people find their way back to God. In Jesus' name.